On the third night, I stopped following the wife. I'd been parked across from the same coffee shop on Magnolia Avenue for 2 hours, watching Diane Hale sit across from the same man she'd met there on Tuesday. Same corner table, same stack of folders between them. He wasn't touching her hand. He wasn't watching the door. He was writing something down while she talked, and whatever she was saying, she said it in a voice low enough that I couldn't read it from the sidewalk. My client had told me this man was her lover. Standing there on the Near Southside sidewalk with a long lens and 5,000 of Marcus Hale's dollars, I was starting to think that wasn't the right word for what he was. I had the photographs, I had the dates, I had the table number and the license plate and the name on the parking validation, which I'd requested from the lot attendant with a story about a fender bender that never happened. The name came back to a firm in Sundance Square. Not a restaurant, not a hotel, an office. I went back to my car. I sat with the engine off. Then I opened my notes from the first client meeting and reread something Marcus had said. Something I'd written down because it bothered me slightly and then filed away. He'd mentioned the coffee shop by name before I told him that's where she went. I looked at the address again. Then I pulled out of the lot and drove north on South Main, not toward Diane Hale, toward her husband. There's a habit I picked up early in this work where I write things down not because they matter yet, but because something says they might. A word that lands wrong, a timing that's slightly off, an answer that technically responds to the question but doesn't quite address it. I was doing this job in Fort Worth, Tarrant County, Texas. I keep an office near the Cultural District, work mostly domestic cases, the kind that start as one thing and turn into something else entirely. Most of the time, the obvious answer is the right one, but every so often a case teaches you that the obvious answer was something somebody built for you, deliberately, to keep you looking in the wrong direction. This case taught me that. If you're new here, subscribe before we go any further. These stories take a while to tell, and you're going to want to be here for the whole thing. And drop a comment right now. What city and state are you watching from? I read every single one, now. Marcus Hale came to me on a Wednesday morning in late October, and the first thing I wrote in my notebook wasn't his wife's name or the amount he was offering. It was a single line I underlined twice before I even knew why. He told me the name of the coffee shop before I told him that's where she went. The first thing I wrote in my notebook wasn't his wife's name or the amount he was offering to pay me. It was a line I underlined twice before I even knew why. He said, "She goes to that coffee shop on Magnolia most mornings, around 8. I hadn't asked him where she went. I hadn't mentioned Magnolia Avenue. I hadn't said anything about coffee. I wrote it down, capped my pen, and kept listening. Most clients will tell you everything you need if you don't interrupt. They fill the silence with the details that matter most to them, which are rarely the details they intend to share. Marcus Hale didn't seem nervous. He sat across from me with both feet flat on the floor and his hands resting on his knees. And he spoke the way a man speaks when he's rehearsed what he's going to say, but is careful enough not to let it sound rehearsed. 44. Medium build, gray dress shirt, sleeves rolled. Commercial real estate, mid-size lease transactions, office and light industrial, out of a suite off Camp Bowie Boulevard. He'd been married to Diane for 11 years. She changed about 4 months ago, he told me. I don't know exactly when. I noticed it one evening in July when I came home and she was on the phone and she stepped outside to finish the call. She'd never done that before. We don't have secrets. I asked him what else he'd noticed. He listed the items in the patient, organized way of someone who had been cataloging them for a while. She'd started keeping her phone face down on the counter. She'd begun going to bed earlier than usual and waking up earlier. She'd made 2 unexplained trips on Saturday mornings in September, telling him she was running errands, but coming back with nothing. She'd started wearing her hair differently, not dramatically, just differently. Did you ask her about any of it? I said. Once. About the Saturday mornings. She said she'd been meeting a friend from work for breakfast. Does she work? She's a buyer for a regional home goods company. Buys for 3 of their Texas stores. Works from home mostly. Goes into their office in Hearst on Tuesdays. I wrote that down. Home office, her own schedule, flexibility during the week. Did you look into the friend? I asked. I looked up the name she gave me. There is a woman by that name who works at the same company. I didn't go further than that. He paused. I figured that was your job. There was nothing aggressive in how he said it. It landed matter-of-factly. He knew what he was there for. He knew what he was asking for, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I asked him what he wanted from me specifically. I want to know who she's meeting, he said. I want photographs if there are photographs to be taken. I want to know what's actually happening. And if what's actually happening is nothing, if she's meeting a friend and the phone thing is a phase, and I watch her for 2 weeks and come back with nothing? He looked at me steadily. Then you come back with nothing, and I pay you for your time, and I figure out what to do with that. That was the right answer. Not every client gives the right answer to that question. Some of them get irritated, like the premise offends them. Some of them tell me they already know what's happening. They just need me to document it. Marcus Hale said he wanted the truth, whatever it was, and he said it like a man who understood the difference between what he hoped was true and what actually might be. I told him my rate. He didn't flinch. He told me he could pay $5,000 up front, which covered the first phase of the surveillance and my time through the first report. He wrote a check, not a digital transfer, an actual paper check, and slid it across the desk without being asked. The handwriting was clean and controlled, every letter the same height. I told him I'd need a physical description of his wife, her vehicle, her daily schedule as he understood it, and the name of the man he suspected. He said he didn't have a name. He said he didn't know who the man was. He described Diane, 41 years old, 5'6", medium brown hair usually worn down, drove a silver Honda CR-V with a Tarrant County plate, he rattled off from memory without looking at his phone. The precision was unremarkable at the time. Some people know their spouse's plate number. Some don't. I wrote it down. Then I asked him to describe the man he'd seen her with. He said he'd seen them together only once, at a distance, in a parking lot near the Hearst office. The man was tall, he said, mid-40s, light hair. He'd been standing next to Diane's CR-V, and they'd been talking for maybe 10 minutes, and when Marcus had driven past, he'd been in the area for a showing, he said. He'd seen them but hadn't stopped. He hadn't wanted to cause a scene. He hadn't been certain of what he was seeing. But something told you it was worth $5,000, I said. He nodded once, the way people nod when they've already had that conversation with themselves. Something did. I started the following Monday. Diane Hale's morning routine matched what Marcus had described almost exactly. Out of the Ridgely house by 7:45, east on I-30 toward the Near Southside. Coffee at a small independent shop on Magnolia Avenue. Home by 9 or 9:30 if she wasn't heading to the Hearst office. The coffee shop part I hadn't told Marcus. He'd mentioned it before I could. I noted it again in my log, shelved it. On Tuesday, 2 days in, she didn't go home after coffee. She sat at a corner table inside for about 20 minutes, and then a man came in, and they sat together for close to an hour. He was tall, mid-40s, light hair going silver at the sides, matching Marcus's description closely enough. He carried a leather portfolio, the kind with a zipper around 3 sides. He ordered nothing. He set the portfolio on the table, opened it, and they went through what looked like printed documents together. She pointed at something on one page. He made a note on another. From my position on the sidewalk, through the window, it looked like a meeting, not a date. People have affairs in coffee shops, but they don't usually bring folders. I photographed them through the window, captured him leaving first, got a clean shot of his face when he turned at the corner. He walked south on South Main and got into a dark blue Audi A6 parked at a meter. I had the plate before he pulled away. I sent Marcus a brief update that evening. Meeting observed, identification in progress. He replied in 4 minutes. What did she say to him? Could you hear anything? I hadn't been close enough. Did she have anything with her? Documents, a bag, her usual tote. No documents observed. Okay. I sat with that exchange before I closed the phone. He'd asked what she said. He'd asked about documents. He hadn't asked who the man was. That was the first note I flagged in red. On Thursday, she went back to the same shop and met the same man. This time, I was inside, 2 tables away, a coffee I didn't need, reading glasses I don't require, a newspaper I wasn't reading. They were not romantic. The body language was transactional in the specific way of a professional relationship where one person is delivering unwelcome news. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, expression shifting into something tight and controlled. He spoke quietly. At one point, he slid a document across the table. She read it without touching it, looked up at him, looked out the window for a moment, then looked back. He took the document back. He didn't leave it with her. I didn't know what it said, but I knew the expression on her face. I'd seen it before, on other clients, on the other side of my desk. The expression of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed. Friday afternoon, I ran the Audi's plate. Registration came back to Harmon & Koester LLP, a law firm, Sundance Square office in downtown Fort Worth, corporate and civil practice. The third name on the firm roster was Brian Koester, an attorney, not a lover. A civil litigator meeting Diane twice a week at a coffee shop, bringing documents he didn't leave behind in a pattern that looked nothing like an affair and a great deal like a legal consultation. I called Marcus that evening and gave him the name. 4 seconds of silence. A lawyer. That's what the firm listing shows. What kind of law? Corporate and civil. She doesn't have any legal matters I know of. Must be work-related. A beat too quick. Before he hung up. And if she brings any documents to those meetings, anything in or out, I'd want to know that. Not, what is she discussing with him? Not, do you think she's in trouble? What he wanted to know was whether she was carrying documents. I wrote that down too. The following Monday, I positioned across the street with better sight lines. Diane arrived at her usual time. Koester 12 minutes later, same portfolio, same quiet manner. At one point, Diane said something that made Koester set down his pen and look at her directly. He nodded once. She sat back with the specific kind of relief that doesn't feel good, the kind that only exists because something bad has been confirmed, and at least the uncertainty is gone. That afternoon, I drove past the parking validation address, Harmon & Koester LLP, 6th floor of a red brick office building off Main Street in Sundance Square, half a block from the Water Gardens. I drove back toward Camp Bowie and thought about a husband who kept asking about his wife's documents instead of her companion. That night, I went back through my first meeting log and reread everything. 2 items stayed on the page. The coffee shop on Magnolia, mentioned before it was mentioned, and a question Marcus had never asked me. Not once across 10 days of updates, 3 reports, 2 phone calls. He'd asked what she said. He'd asked about documents. He'd asked if she was being careful. He'd never asked the most obvious question a worried husband would ask. Why is my wife meeting with a civil litigator? The answer I kept arriving at was the same. He already knew. The second phone I noticed on a Tuesday. Diane had arrived at the coffee shop at her usual time, ordered her usual drink, and sat at the corner table. Koester hadn't arrived yet. She was alone for about 14 minutes, and during those 14 minutes, she did something I hadn't seen her do before. She took a second phone from the inside pocket of her jacket, checked something on the screen, typed a short message, and put it back. Then she took out her regular phone, the one she carried in her tote bag, and set it on the table face up, the way a person does when they're expecting a call they don't mind being visible. 2 phones, one she showed, one she didn't. I documented it and kept my position. People carry second phones for a lot of reasons: work lines, privacy, a number they give to certain contacts and not others. In a case that had started as a cheating investigation, a second phone read the way it always reads at first. It read like confirmation. I reported it to Marcus that evening. I kept my language neutral, observed subject in possession of a secondary mobile device, details to follow. His response came back in under 3 minutes. What color was it? Not. Did you see who she texted? Not. Do you think it's a burner? What color was it? I told him it was black, standard size. He wrote back, "Okay, good." I looked at that word for a while. Good. Not concerning, not worrying, not what I feared. Good. Like a man crossing something off a list. I didn't respond further that night. Wednesday, I pulled back and watched from distance. She drove her usual route east on I-30, met Coaster at Magnolia. Same table, same portfolio, shorter meeting. 38 minutes instead of the usual hour. I spent the afternoon running Coaster through everything publicly available. Texas State Bar, licensed since 2004, good standing, no disciplinary history. The Harmon & Coaster firm had been registered with the Secretary of State for 9 years. Their public site listed practice areas: commercial litigation, contract disputes, business fraud, asset recovery. Business fraud, asset recovery, I underlined both. That evening, I made a decision I don't make lightly on domestic cases. I decided to look at the client. It's not standard practice. You're hired to watch a subject, and the boundary is usually clear. But Marcus had given me 10 days of responses that didn't fit the shape of a worried husband. They fit a different shape I hadn't fully named yet. He'd mentioned keeping regular hours, in by 8:30, out by 6 or 6:30. I drove past his Camp Bowie suite at 6:15. His dark gray Ford Explorer was still in the lot. He came out at 6:52, sat in the car for 4 minutes without moving, the kind of thing people do on calls they don't want overheard, then backed out and drove north. I followed at distance. He drove to a gas station off White Settlement Road and filled up the tank. He went inside and came out with a coffee. He drove to a strip mall on Horn Street and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes, engine running, before he drove away again without going into any of the stores. People do this. They drive when they're thinking. It didn't mean anything on its own. He took Loop 820 north and eventually turned into a residential area in the Fossil Creek neighborhood. A quiet stretch of houses with brick facades and 2-car driveways, the kind of street where every yard had a sprinkler system and a flag bracket by the front door. He slowed in front of one house in particular, a ranch-style single-story with a dark green front door and a realtor's lockbox still on the handle, even though no sign was visible in the yard. He sat in front of it for 2 minutes and 20 seconds, I counted, and then drove on. I noted the address and kept following. He went home after that. I drove past the Ridgelea house and saw the lights on in the front room and both vehicles in the driveway, and I headed back toward my side of the city. The house on Fossil Creek sat in my notes for the rest of the night, quiet and unremarkable looking, the kind of detail that might mean everything or nothing at all depending on what came next. On Thursday evening, Marcus called me instead of texting. He said he wanted to meet in person. He said he had some additional information he thought might be relevant. We agreed on a time. The following morning, Thursday, 9 o'clock, my office. He arrived 7 minutes early. He sat down in the same chair, same posture, same flat feet on the floor. He had a manila envelope in his hand, which he set on the desk between us without opening it. "I found something," he said. "At home. I think it might help clarify what Diane is doing with this lawyer." I asked him what he'd found. "Some paperwork in her home office. I don't want to go into too much detail yet, but I think she may be involved in something. Some kind of dispute with a vendor or a contractor through her company. The lawyer might be representing her on a work matter. I thought if you had context, it might help you understand what you're looking at." I looked at the envelope. "Is that the paperwork?" "No." He picked up the envelope and put it in his lap. "This is something else. Personal financial records. I thought you might need to understand her routine better, her spending patterns." I told him that financial records weren't something I typically needed for a surveillance case. He nodded and said he understood, said he'd brought them just in case, said he'd hold on to them for now. He set the envelope on the edge of the desk beside his chair rather than back in his lap. We talked for another 20 minutes. He asked whether Diane had brought anything to the meetings with Custer. I said I hadn't observed her carrying anything out. He asked whether I thought Custer might be representing someone adverse to Diane, whether the meetings might be something other than Diane being Custer's client. I told him it was possible, but that the body language I'd observed suggested Kuster was advising her, not negotiating against her. Marcus nodded slowly at that. Advising her on what, though? He said. Not quite a question, more like a thought he'd forgotten to keep to himself. I didn't answer it. When he stood to leave, he picked up the envelope from the edge of the desk and tucked it under his arm. We shook hands. He walked out. I went to the window and watched him cross the parking lot to his Explorer. He opened the rear passenger door and tossed the envelope onto the back seat, and then got in the front and drove away. I went back to my desk and sat down. Then I picked up my phone and called the office manager at Harmon & Kuster. I didn't identify myself as a private investigator. I said I was trying to confirm an appointment for a client matter, and I'd been given the firm's number. The office manager was polite and unhelpful in the standard way of legal offices. Confirmed the firm existed, confirmed their address, couldn't confirm any client information. I thanked her and hung up. That afternoon, I drove out to the house on Fossil Creek that Marcus had idled in front of the previous evening. Daylight made it easier to see. The lockbox was still on the door. The yard was maintained, but the landscaping had that specific thinness of a property that hadn't been lived in recently. No mail in the box, no vehicle in the driveway. A single potted plant on the front step that had been allowed to die. I wrote down the address. That evening, my phone buzzed. Marcus. He thought he'd left a manila envelope in my office. I told him I'd watched him take it when he left. He said he must have left it somewhere else, apologized, wished me good night. I thought about the Explorer, the rear passenger door, the envelope on the back seat, the specific, deliberate way a person picks up something they don't want to leave behind. The next morning, I drove to the Fossil Creek address first, parked on the street, walked the perimeter the way anyone might walk past a house they were casually curious about. Super lockbox on the door, professionally maintained yard, no sign of anyone living there. I went back to my car and opened my laptop. The Tarrant County Appraisal District database is public and fully searchable. I entered the address. The ownership record came back in 11 seconds. Not Marcus Hale, not a trust, not an LLC. Diane Hale. I read it twice. Then I read the recording date. 14 months ago. Diane Hale had owned a house in Fossil Creek for 14 months. A house with a dead plant on the step and a lockbox on the door. And in 10 days of conversation, her husband had never mentioned it. He'd sat in front of it for 2 minutes and 20 seconds on a Wednesday evening. And the next morning he'd come to my office with a manila envelope he ultimately decided not to leave behind. I spent Friday morning at my desk and didn't move for 3 hours. The Tarrant County Appraisal District record showed the Fossil Creek property registered to Diane Hale for 14 months. That was the first fact. It was clean, public, verifiable, and it meant nothing by itself. People own property their spouses don't know about. It happens in divorces, in estate planning, in situations where one partner manages finances independently. The property record alone wasn't damning, but it was a loose thread. And I've learned over the years that loose threads in a case like this don't appear accidentally. I pulled up the Texas Comptroller's taxable entity search. Free, public, searchable by name or address. I entered the Fossil Creek street address as a keyword and ran the query. One result came back. A limited liability company registered to that address. Incorporated 22 months ago, 2 months before the property itself was recorded in Diane's name. The registered agent was listed as a third-party service, which is common. Plenty of legitimate businesses use registered agent services to keep a professional address on public filings. The manager, however, was listed separately in the initial certificate of formation documents, which I accessed through the Secretary of State's SOS Direct portal for a $1 search fee. The manager's name was Marcus D. Hale. I sat back in my chair. I read it again. Marcus D. Hale, listed as managing member of an LLC incorporated at a Fossil Creek address, an address that, 2 months after the LLC was formed, was recorded as real property owned by Diane Hale, his wife, who, according to Marcus, knew nothing about any legal matters. I thought about the question he'd asked me on day 3 of the surveillance. Not who is Brian Coaster, not what does he practice. He'd asked what kind of law Coaster practiced, and when I'd told him corporate and civil, he'd said it must be a work matter. He'd moved past it quickly. Too quickly for a man who was supposedly learning this information for the first time. I went back to my handwritten notes from the first meeting. Paper logs, exact wording, no paraphrase. About 12 minutes in, before he'd given me the full picture, Marcus had said something I'd noted and set aside. It had fit cleanly into the surface narrative. Reading it now, it didn't fit at all. She doesn't have any legal matters I know of. There's no reason she'd be meeting with an attorney. Not. I don't think she has any legal matters. Not, as far as I know. He'd said she had no reason to meet with an attorney. A man who didn't know what his wife was doing would express confusion. He wouldn't express certainty about the absence of a reason. A man who knew exactly what she might discover, and knew what she'd find would give her a very clear reason to seek legal counsel, would phrase it exactly that way. He wasn't confused about why she was meeting Custer. He was hoping I hadn't figured out why yet. I spent the next 90 minutes pulling everything I could from the Tarrant County District Clerk's public records portal. Civil filings, judgment records, anything connected to Marcus Hale's name or the LLC address. The district clerk system is publicly accessible online, indexed by party name, and covers civil and family court filings going back years. I searched Marcus Hale individually and came up empty on active litigation. I searched the LLC name and came up empty there too. That absence didn't reassure me. It told me that if something legal was in motion, it hadn't been filed yet. Or it had been filed somewhere that wasn't Tarrant County. I called a colleague. Patrice, Financial Investigations, knows public database systems better than anyone I've worked with. LLC address, manager name. Any UCC filings, judgment liens, creditor actions in the Texas public record. She called back 40 minutes later. 1 UCC financing statement. A lien from a private creditor, filed 18 months ago through the Secretary of State's UCC division. The secured party, an individual, not a bank. Collateral description, broad, equipment, receivables, and real property interests connected to the LLC. Real property interests. The Fossil Creek house had been recorded in Diane's name 2 months after that lien was filed. A lien filed against an LLC managed by Marcus Hale. 2 months later, a property connected to that LLC's address recorded under Diane Hale's name. Property sits vacant over a year. Diane quietly engages a civil litigator specializing in business fraud and asset recovery. Not a picture of infidelity. A picture of a husband who moved an asset into his wife's name, possibly without her knowledge, to place it beyond a creditor's reach. A wife who found something and hired a lawyer without telling him. A husband who then hired a private investigator, not to catch his wife cheating, but to find out how much she knew. I went back through every exchange with Marcus and reread each one with the new frame. His first question after I identified Custer, what kind of law does he practice? His repeated interest in documents, his question about the second phone, what color was it? His Wednesday evening visit to the Fossil Creek house, 2 minutes in front of it, not going in. The manila envelope he'd brought and not shown me. His statement on day 1, she has no reason to be meeting with an attorney. He hadn't hired me to prove his wife was cheating. He'd hired me to surveil the woman about to become his legal problem, using a cheating investigation as the frame, which would give my photographs and reports a domestic cover story if they surfaced in a proceeding. I was his reconnaissance operation. That recognition landed somewhere uncomfortable. Not because I'd done anything improper. Everything I'd done was lawful. Everything I'd observed was from public locations. Everything I'd reported was factual. But I'd been used as a tool in a strategy I hadn't consented to and hadn't understood. And the subject I'd been surveilling wasn't a cheating wife. She was a woman who had discovered something about her husband and was quietly building a case about it. I spent a long time thinking about what my obligations were. A private investigator in Texas works for the client who retains them. That relationship has limits. I can't break the law on a client's behalf, fabricate evidence, or be used as an instrument of harassment. But there's no clean rulebook for the moments when what a client tells you and what is actually happening diverge significantly. I hadn't been hired for the purpose Marcus described. I'd been given a false investigative frame to produce surveillance materials that served an undisclosed purpose. I hadn't violated any law, but I was sitting on information, a property, an LLC, a creditor lien, assembled from public records in the course of understanding a case I'd been handed under false pretenses. I thought about Diane Hale, the expression on her face when Kuster slid a document across the table, the expression of someone receiving confirmation of something they already feared, the second phone in her jacket pocket, the one she didn't put on the table. There's a version where that phone was the tool of an affair. I'd believed that version for 10 days because Marcus had built the frame carefully. There's another version where that second phone was how she communicated with her attorney, the one her husband didn't know about, kept separate because she understood on some level that she might be watched. She'd been right. Marcus had given me her number himself, full contact sheet day one, in case I needed to reach her for the cover story. Before I tell you what she said when she answered, if you followed this case from the beginning, you have the same information I had at that moment. The Fossil Creek house, the LLC, the lien filed 18 months ago, the property recorded in Diane's name 2 months after that lien. A husband who kept asking about documents instead of the man. Put your theory in the comments right now. What do you think Marcus actually did? And how much did Diane already know? I opened the case file, found the number, and dialed. It rang 3 times. Then she answered cautious, the way people answer numbers they don't recognize. Hello? Mrs. Hale, I said. My name is unimportant right now, but I think there's something you need to know. There was a silence. And then, very quietly, she said, Is this about the house? She didn't hang up. That was the first thing I noted. A woman receiving a call from an unknown number being told that the caller has something she needs to know. Most people hang up. Or they ask immediately who's calling and don't proceed until they have an answer. Diane Hale said, Is this about the house? And then she waited. Did your husband tell you he hired anyone to look into your recent activities? No, he didn't. I'm a private investigator. He retained me 11 days ago. Told me he believed you were involved in an extramarital relationship. She exhaled, the exhale of someone who has just had a theory confirmed. How much did he pay you? $5,000 up front. Of course he did. What did you find? I told her, meetings with an attorney, Brian Kuster, nothing suggesting anything other than a legal consultation, that I'd then found the property record, the Fossil Creek address recorded in her name 14 months ago. I found out about that house 3 months ago. I was looking for our flood insurance renewal, and the paperwork was in the same drawer. Did you confront him? No. I called Brian first. Not an affair. A lifeline. Mrs. Hale, I said, I want to be straightforward with you. I was retained by your husband under a frame I now believe was inaccurate. My investigation has produced public records that I compiled independently, and what I've found raises questions I don't think I can set aside. I'm not calling to threaten anyone or to take sides. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know you've been under surveillance, and because I think what I've found may be relevant to whatever you're working on with your attorney. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Can we meet? We agreed on that afternoon. A coffee shop in the cultural district, away from Magnolia, away from anything Marcus had asked me to document. She arrived before I did. Corner table, back to the wall, sightlines to the door. The same position she'd chosen at the Magnolia shop. Dark blazer, hair pulled back, regular phone on the table, hands folded over it. No tote bag, no folders. You're not what I expected, she said when I sat down. Someone following Marcus's instructions, she said, before I could answer. Not someone who figured out Marcus's instructions were wrong. I told her I preferred to think of it as following the evidence. She almost smiled. Not quite. I showed her the public records I'd pulled. The Tarrant County Appraisal District ownership record, the Texas Comptroller entity filing for the LLC, the UCC lien filed against the LLC before the property was recorded in her name. I had printed copies, which I set on the table between us without pushing them toward her. She looked at each one. "I have most of these," she said. "Brian found the LLC filing about 6 weeks ago. The lien took us another 2 weeks to trace." She looked up. "The property deed is what we needed, the actual transfer document. That's recorded with the county clerk," I said. "It would be public record." Brian requested a copy. It takes time. She set the last page down. "We're still waiting on it." I looked at her for a moment. Then I opened my laptop. The Tarrant County Clerk's Real Estate Records portal is publicly accessible and searchable by grantor and grantee name. I'd searched it the previous evening after piecing together the sequence of the LLC, the lien, and the property registration, and I'd found what I was looking for in under 20 minutes. A deed of transfer recorded 14 months ago, conveying the Fossil Creek property to Diane Marie Hale as sole owner. The instrument had been executed by Marcus Dennis Hale, acting as attorney-in-fact for Diane Marie Hale under a durable power of attorney. I turned the laptop to face her and let her read it. She read it twice. Her expression didn't change dramatically. There was a tightening around her eyes, the particular stillness of a person choosing not to react until they've processed what they've seen. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and took out the secondary phone, the black one, the one I'd documented 11 days ago on a Tuesday morning across a coffee shop window. And she typed a message without looking up. "That's Brian," she said. "I'm sending him the instrument number." "There's a power of attorney referenced in the deed," I said. "I wasn't able to pull that document from the portal. It may be recorded separately or held privately, but the deed itself references it by date and notary information." "Marcus had me sign a general POA 3 years ago," she said. "He was doing a large transaction, needed flexibility. Said it was standard practice." She set the phone face down on the table. "I signed it because I trusted him. No bitterness. It was a fact she'd already spent time with." "Do you know what he used the property for?" "Brian's theory is collateral for a private loan, a business partner, a deal that went wrong. When it collapsed, there was a debt. Rather than disclose it through his own LLC, he moved the collateral into my name using the POA. If anyone came looking, the asset appeared to belong to me. A separate party." She looked at the screen. "I had no idea I owned a house in Fossil Creek until I found the paperwork in that drawer." I thought about Marcus in front of that house. 2 minutes and 20 seconds. The dead plant on the step. "He drove past it," I said. 10 days ago. I was behind him. He checks on it. He's worried the creditor will try to attach it. If it's in my name with no documented connection to him beyond the POA, he may have thought it was insulated." "Except the POA is referenced in the deed," I said, "which is a public record." "Which Brian found." She picked up her regular phone, looked at the screen, set it down. "And which you found." I nodded. She looked at me directly. "What are you going to do with what you found?" It was the right question. The only question, really, that mattered at this point. I told her the truth, retained under a misrepresented purpose. The surveillance materials documented her meetings with an attorney, nothing more. My obligation to a client doesn't extend to being used as an instrument of a strategy I wasn't informed about. "I'm not going to fabricate anything," I said, "and I'm not going to pretend I haven't seen what I've seen. The power of attorney, the deed, the lien. Can you document where you found those?" "Public records with source URLs and instrument numbers. I can produce a clean summary." She looked at me with something that wasn't quite gratitude, more like the recognition of something unexpected arriving from an unexpected direction. "He hired you to find out what I know," she said. "That's my current assessment. And instead, you found out what he did." I closed the laptop. "I found what the records show. What that means is for you and your attorney to determine." She nodded. I thought about the manila envelope, the one Marcus had nearly left on my desk, and then retrieved with the deliberateness of a man who remembered something important at the last second. "When your husband came to my office last Thursday," I said, "he brought a manila envelope. Described it as personal financial records. He didn't show me and he took it when he left." She waited. "I don't know what was in it. But based on his questions that morning, I think it may have related to the property or the LLC. He was gauging what I'd already found." "He was checking your work," she said. "He was checking what I knew." She looked at me with the composed attention of someone who has recently learned to hold a great deal of information without letting it show. "Brian needs a copy of that deed," she said. "The instrument number is on the county clerk's portal," I said. "The copy fee is standard, $20 for the first page, $4 per additional page thereafter. He can request it directly, or I can pull it and provide it as part of my case documentation, since I located it in the course of my investigation." "Do that," she said. I told her I would. 11 days, she said finally. "He had you on me for 11 days. Starting the Monday after your first meeting with Koester." She was quiet. "He knew I'd gone to a lawyer. He suspected you'd found something and wanted to know how far along you were." She nodded once, the same single nod I'd seen Marcus use. I wondered if they'd acquired that habit from each other. "He almost had me doubting myself," she said, mostly to the table. 3 months of thinking, maybe I'm reading it wrong. Maybe I don't understand how his business works." She looked up. "He told me the POA was standard practice." "It may have been," I said. "How he used it is a different question." She picked up both phones and put them in her jacket pockets, straightened the printed records and squared the edges. "I need to make a call," she said. She stood, paused, and looked at me with a directness I've thought about more than once since. "He paid you $5,000, she said. "Did you earn it?" "Not the way he intended," I said. She walked toward the door, and I sat with a county deed recorded 14 months ago and the instrument number of a power of attorney used, quietly, deliberately, to put a house in someone's name without telling them they owned it. I printed the deed that evening from my office. 31 pages. It cost me the online access fee and about 8 minutes of my time. I set it on my desk and looked at it. Then I looked at the space on the edge of my desk where Marcus Hale had set his manila envelope on Thursday morning. The space he'd picked it up from with both hands, carefully, before he walked out. I was fairly certain I was looking at the same document he'd been carrying. The question that remained wasn't what Marcus had done. The question was what he'd planned to do next. Marcus called me on a Saturday morning. I was in my car outside a diner off Camp Bowie, coffee in hand, going through my notes from the previous week, when the call came in. I let it ring twice before I answered. "I haven't heard from you in a few days," he said. His voice was level, conversational. The voice of a man who had decided that the best approach to an uncertain situation was to behave as though nothing was uncertain. I told him I'd been compiling the full surveillance report. "Anything new since we last spoke?" "Nothing that changes the picture significantly," I said. A pause. Not long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means the subject's pattern of behavior has been consistent throughout the surveillance period. Twice weekly meetings with the same individual at the same location. No additional contacts I haven't already reported." "And the documents?" he said. "Did she ever bring anything?" "I didn't observe her transporting documents to or from the meetings." Another pause. This one had a different quality to it. The quality of a man recalculating. "I'd like to see the full report," he said. "Everything you have." I told him I'd have it ready by Monday and that we could meet at my office to go through it. He agreed. He said Monday was fine. He asked if there was anything he should know before then. "I'll have everything organized when we sit down," I said. He said, "Good." And then, after a beat, "You've done solid work on this. I want you to know that." I thanked him and ended the call. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes after that. The compliment had arrived at the exact moment a person delivers a compliment when they want something from you. Not at the beginning of the conversation, when it would seem generous, and not at the end, where it would seem like a farewell, but in the specific middle space where it functions as a bid. He wanted my goodwill. He wanted to know I was still his. I drove back to my office. I spent Sunday organizing the case file. Surveillance logs, photographs, date and time records, vehicle descriptions, the written summaries I'd sent Marcus throughout. All factual, all lawfully gathered. The public records, the appraisal district ownership record, the Texas Comptroller entity filing, the UCC lien, the county clerk deed, were in a separate folder. I had not compiled those at Marcus's direction. I'd compiled them while trying to understand a case I'd been handed under false pretenses. They were mine, not his. I did not include them in what I prepared for Monday. Marcus arrived at 9. Navy shirt this time instead of gray. Same flat feet on the floor, same hands on his knees. He was very good at looking like himself. I set the surveillance report on the desk, 22 pages, photographs tabbed behind a summary sheet. He paged through it slowly, the way a person reads something they already know the shape of. He paused at a photograph of Diane and Kuster at the corner table, both of them leaning slightly forward, the leather portfolio open between them. "This is Kuster," he said, not a question. "Brian Kuster, Harmon and Kuster LLP, Sundance Square. And you're confident this is the full picture?" I met his eyes. "The report reflects everything I observed during the surveillance period. True, also precisely worded." "She's meeting a civil litigator," he said. "That's what the firm listing indicates. Business fraud, asset recovery." He said it like confirming something he already knew. He closed the report and squared it on the desk edge. "I appreciate the thoroughness. This is useful." He produced a folded check from his breast pocket. "The balance we discussed." The handwriting was the same controlled, uniform script as the first one. "I want to ask you something," I said. "The house on Fossil Creek, you drove past it on a Wednesday evening about 10 days ago. I was behind you." The stillness that came over him was specific. Not shock, not guilt. The stillness of a man who has just learned his perimeter is smaller than he thought and is recalculating how much he needs to concede. "I drive past a lot of properties. It's my business." "The property is recorded under your wife's name in the Tarrant County Appraisal District. I found that when I ran the address." He looked at me, said nothing. "It's a public database. I wasn't searching it on your behalf. I was trying to understand what I was looking at." 5 seconds of silence. "That's a property matter. It has nothing to do with what you were hired for." "I know," I said. "That's why it's not in the report." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not relief, but the recalibration of a man who has identified the nature of his threat and found it slightly smaller than he feared. "Good," he said. "That's as it should be." I put the check in my desk drawer without depositing it into the conversation. "Marcus, I'm closing this case today. The report is yours. I won't be conducting additional surveillance on your behalf or available for follow-up on this matter." "Any particular reason?" "Professional judgment." He nodded once. "Fair enough." He stood, buttoned his shirt cuff. "I hope the work was satisfactory." "It was thorough," I said. He left without shaking my hand. I listened to his car pull out of the lot and sat at my desk for a while after the sound of the engine faded. Then I picked up my phone and called Patrice. I told her I needed one more search, any civil filings in Tarrant County or the surrounding jurisdictions connected to the LLC address over the next 60 days. I told her I'd explain when there was something to explain. She told me she'd keep an eye on it. 11 days later, she called back. A civil petition had been filed in Tarrant County District Court. Plaintiff, Diane Marie Hale. The specific causes of action were sealed in the initial filing per standard procedure, but the instrument number Patrice pulled connected to the same LLC address I'd been working with for 3 weeks. The registered agent had been formally served. The public record showed that something had been filed by a woman who, 3 weeks earlier, had been sitting at a corner table reading a document she wasn't allowed to keep, with an expression I now understood completely. She'd been confirming that what she'd found in the drawer was real. It was. 2 days after the filing, Patrice mentioned in passing that Marcus's gray Explorer had been photographed by a parking enforcement camera near the Tarrant County Courthouse. She'd found it incidentally. Filing something, responding to something, recalculating. He was the kind of man who would recalculate all the way to the end. 3 weeks after I closed the case, I drove back to the Near Southside on a Thursday morning, parked on South Main, and walked to the coffee shop on Magnolia, the independent place with the chalkboard menu and the corner table near the window. The corner table was empty. Laptops, earbuds, paper cups. No leather portfolio. No printed documents. No second phone retrieved from an inside pocket and checked and put carefully away. I thought about the envelope Marcus had nearly left on the edge of my desk. The way he'd picked it up at the last second, both hands, deliberate. He'd known that whatever was in it was the same thing I might eventually find on my own. He'd been right about that. He just hadn't calculated that finding it would change whose side I was on, because he hadn't understood that I didn't work in sides. I worked in what the records showed, and the records had been public the whole time. Somewhere across the city, in a filing system accessible for a standard copying fee, a 31-page deed sat in the Tarrant County Clerk's office, with a power of attorney reference on page 4, and an instrument number that connected, if you followed it carefully, to a man who had paid me $5,000 to look at his wife while she was busy looking at him. I ordered a coffee I didn't need and stood on the sidewalk in the November air. The case was closed. Whatever came next belonged to other people. There's something this case kept coming back to, and it's not the property or the power of attorney or the lien filed against a company most people would never think to search for. It's the first meeting. Marcus Hale sat across from my desk in late October, and within 15 minutes mentioned a coffee shop on Magnolia Avenue I hadn't told him about. I wrote it down. I underlined it twice, and then I kept going. I had a client, a subject, a frame, and the frame was a husband who suspected his wife was cheating. The frame was the problem. 10 days of surveillance, daily logs, photographs through coffee shop windows, phone exchanges where Marcus asked questions that didn't quite fit a worried husband. 10 days before I ran an address through a public database, and the whole architecture collapsed in 11 seconds. The frame was built well. Marcus understood a PI on a cheating case watches the wife. He understood the photographs of Diane and her attorney, stripped of context, could be useful if things went a certain legal direction. He understood the best way to learn how much Diane knew was to hire someone to watch her under a domestic cover story. What he didn't account for was the coffee shop. One detail, volunteered before it was mentioned, written down by someone who collects those details, not because he knows what they mean, but because 15 years of this work has taught him that the ones that don't fit are usually the ones that matter. That's the job. Not catching people in lies, not proving what a client already believes. The job is noticing what doesn't fit and following it until you understand why. Here's what I've been sitting with. Marcus knew the frame would eventually become visible. He's too careful not to have known. So when he hired me, was he buying surveillance or was he buying time? If you've got a theory, drop it in the comments. And if you stayed with this one all the way through, you already know where the subscribe button is. Hit it, because there are more cases where this one came from, and some of them are stranger than this. I'll see you on the next one.